Welcome to Hoco Polizzo, The Writing Life. I'm E. Ethelbert Miller, and our guest today is Joseph Roth. Joseph Roth is the author of 3 collections of poetry, Meaning Bone Man, 2012, Gospel of Dust, 2013, and Ache, which will be published in 2017. Thank you for being here, Joseph.
I'm glad to. Thank you.
You know, I read your blog now and then, and back in December of last year, you wrote the following, that America is not working for most of its people. If we accept it as being true, what should poets or writers do about this? How do we correct this?
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of different things that poets and writers can do, but I certainly believe that poets and writers and everybody has a role to try to adjust this. It's certainly true, it seems to me, undeniable that America is not working for most of its people. I was raised in a union house. My dad was an organizer for the United Steelworkers, and he was a steelworker for a while and then worked other kinds of labor jobs. And we just were raised to sort of see the world from that perspective, the perspective of the bottom up, the sort of little guy who needed the job, who depended on his paycheck. And my dad was of that, you know, what they called the greatest generation, who he finished high school and then was in the Army in World War II in the Pacific, came back, did those laboring jobs, but was able to buy a house, was able to put his kids through Catholic school, through college, and then was able to retire. And I don't think you could do that today on that level of education or with that kind of a job these days. The economy has shifted, our societal values have shifted, and
at the same time, when you talk about that shift, it challenges many people in terms of their faith.
Yeah.
When I read your work, it seems as if the Bible was there on the table in your household.
It was, yeah. I was raised as a very devout Catholic. My dad was a little bit of an irreverent Catholic, perhaps. My mom was a convert, and they can be the most devout sometimes. And so we were raised with that unique part of the Catholic tradition that, in fact, I think Pope Francis today is sort of revitalizing, that social justice tradition, where workers were valued, unions were valued. We were raised seeing the world from that perspective and with that religious foundation to it, kind of bolstered by our faith.
Now, you left your house and you went into the seminary.
Yeah.
That must have been a big decision for you.
Sure, yeah. I had taught for a couple of years after college out in Southern California, and then went to Notre Dame and was in their divinity program, was a priest for some years, taught in the writing program at Notre Dame, and then after 10 years left that eventually and came to DC and have still been teaching and writing in a variety of ways. But
when you talk about writing variety, let's look at the Gospel of Dust. I mean, right there we see that connection.
Yeah.
And you actually have poems there which draw upon, from the Bible.
Yeah.
Was that something that the seeds were planted a long time ago, or did you now, as you are teaching writing, becoming a writer, you say, okay, I can take this and open the door, and this is the path I want to take?
Yeah. Sort of both. Those seeds were planted long ago. Some of those images from Scripture, certainly some of the Mary at the foot of the cross images, the Our Lady of Sorrows comes to Birmingham. Some of those images, if Mamie Till was the mother of God, those images are seared into me. I think in a good way. They're very powerful images to me.
I always tease you when I met you the first time. I told you reminded me of Thomas Merton.
I know you're going to say that. Yeah.
And I bring that up because Thomas Merton was a poet.
Yeah.
And I wondered, did his work ever influence you?
Absolutely, yeah. And when I was at Notre Dame, I knew the drive from South Bend, Indiana, straight down to Bardstown, Kentucky, to Gethsemane. I spent lots of chunks of summers there, lots of long weekends there on retreats. I knew the woods where he walked. His work has meant a lot to me over the years.
When we look at your work, you're able to look at things from different perspectives. How difficult is it for the poet to work the imagination and see things from somewhere else? I mean, you talked about, religion and faith, and that teaches you a certain compassion. But now as a writer, when you really begin to say, okay, I want to really look at this, and I'm not just talking about like a persona, but really begin to say, okay, I'm going to look at something from the completely opposite side.
Yeah. You know, I guess it takes a kind of empathy that I'm glad I'm able to muster at times. I think sometimes it takes sort of actual research. You know, if you want to try to write, as you say, and write in someone else's voice, or you really want to try to, you want to put some, or you want to write about questions of race, for example, that you know, I don't write from the perspective of a black person, obviously, but race and some of the historical events that are sort of racially charged in our history play a prominent role in my writing. You have to know what you're talking about, I think. You have to know the history, so you have to read a lot.
Well, let's look at that, because you're talking about reading and research,
Yeah.
okay? You bring in a young person, they might feel, you know, poetry is all emotion, it's how I feel.
Mm-hmm.
But you're talking about the research, you're talking about like heavy lifting here.
Yeah.
Okay, how do you bring the two together?
I think that the research sometimes provides sort of a lane for the passion to go through, so that it's not blah, this explosion of passion, which is sort of uncontrolled and not moderated. But if you know, I was in researching the, you know, Mamie Till for some of and the murder of her son, for some of those poems, I came across this Willie Lewis character, you know, and I felt myself feeling so strongly about what he went through, the decision of an 18-year-old black kid in Mississippi to testify against these white men.
Let's hear those poems right now.
Yeah, so Willie Lewis, you know, I felt so strongly about what he had to go through, but then doing the research sort of puts you, it controls that a little bit. I hope it lets the voice say it in a way that's not just shrieking or screaming. Sure. So Willie Lewis, 18-year-old kid, is walking down the road outside Money, Mississippi, and here comes this pickup truck with somebody in the back covered in tarp, and then he later sees that pickup truck parked outside of a barn, and he hears something horrible going on inside. And a white guy comes out of the barn and says, you know, you didn't see anything, did you? And he just says, you know, no, sir, and walks on. But then would later learn what happened, and then would testify against those men, which was not common in Mississippi, 1955. He had to leave Mississippi. He had to change his name. He had to have FBI protection. So I just was so moved by that, again, that decision that an ordinary person made. He wasn't an activist or a hero in some way. He wasn't a policymaker. He was 18 years old. Mm-hmm. So this is When Your Word is a Match for Willie Lewis, 1937, 2013. When you walk past Klansmen smiling at you on your way into the courthouse, wondering how you will ever live here after this airless day. When you tell the story of a pickup truck, a barn, a boy, a threat. When you point at two men in the courtroom and everyone gasps at what they have never seen before but know is true. When your word is a match head hissing into flame, testifying aloud but blown out as soon as you speak. When all the air in the courtroom shakes its white head. When the smiling men brag about killing the boy in the barn. When they joke about a river, about what cannot float. When you flee to the mother's city to breathe air that isn't a gasp. When you hide the name your parents gave you for fear the men from that barn will come smiling for you too. When you speak to your wife years later after a lifetime of breathing beside her. When this air thick as lead presses your chest to breaking. When the match's flame consumes all the air, revealing a coffin, a boy, a mother, and you burning still.
When you write a poem like that, and we put another hat on, how do you workshop something like that? You bring a poem like that into a group, okay? They don't know the story, okay? They're just looking at it as a poem.
Yeah.
Do you open it where, oh, I'll listen to what you do, or you have to say, you're gonna have to know the research, you're gonna have to know what's happened before you can touch this poem?
I did workshop that poem actually with a small group of friends, of fellow poets, and I think I probably told them the story first too. And then the things that they were able to help me with were, you know, the poem, for example, I think it deals with such an intense and charged occasion, it doesn't need charged language. So maybe moderating down, kind of dialing down some of the language. You know, you don't need to say, this was horrible, right? You know?
Right.
So it's kind of dialing down the language when the event itself, I think, speaks for itself.
Well, let's look at this. You're a teacher,
Yeah.
okay? and you're teaching like high school kids.
Yeah.
We're at a time right now which is charged, okay? So a student comes in and they're thinking Ferguson, they're with Baltimore, and you say, okay, I'm gonna read a poem that I wrote a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
How does it now communicate over a period of time? Do you see something, that, for example, that you have to say, okay, my poem is about this, but this is the connection you can make with this, or this is just a poem that there isn't any connection, but it does show you about violence, but this is a different type of violence that we're dealing with, but you need to know this history.
Yeah.
How does the poem work in the classroom?
It works well in the classroom, and I think especially if students are being asked to write poetry or to appreciate literature, it can be a great advantage for the teacher to be a practitioner of the art that he's teaching, you know. And with a poem like this, you know, you don't even have to say, oh, by the way, Michael Brown, you know.
Right. Let's talk about your teaching, and let's use, have you selected a writer that is very important to you?
Yeah.
Okay, select a writer is very important to you. And then my question is, how do you teach that writer? You like the writer, but how do you teach that writer?
Yeah.
So who's the writer that you would select?
Well, when you first asked it, I just think of who we just finished reading, Frederick Douglass, in my American literature classes. I tell him a little bit about what his life was, the biographical details of his life, that he lived not very far from where you and I sit right now, was born on a plantation near Easton, Maryland, tried to escape a couple of times, sent to the slave breaker a couple of times, finally escapes, and then, you know, sort of blooms into the trajectory of this life. It's almost unbelievable. You know, he would end up being a kind of a minister to Haiti, you know, living on a hill in what would become Southeast DC, I mean, he always was a brilliant and a bright and distinguished man, but he was able to really sort of inhabit the life that he dreamed. I think you sort of say a few of those things to give them the context, and then you let Frederick Douglass do the work and assign the work, and they read it, we talk about it. You know, high school kids are high school kids, some of it flies right past them. Others, especially with Douglass, it happens almost every year. You know, you can just see, you can see somebody kind of catching fire reading him.
Well, let's look at this. Many times in the classroom, we want to separate the author from the text.
Yeah.
But now we bring you back. What's going on in our society is going on. And someone says, well, Joe, but you're white. How can you write a poem like this? What do you tell them?
I just don't think that makes any difference. I mean, if you're in America, the race challenges that we have faced for the 200 plus years of the American idea, the American experiment, I think, as you've said, it's always been something we wrestle with. It's the country I live in. It's the country you live in. Yes, I live in it in a different way because of my skin as compared to yours. And in some ways, I think for my white students, and I teach both, for my white students, it's more important almost to learn about the consequences of their own privilege, the consequences of you know, the way that policies have embraced white supremacy, the ways that that's unfolded.
Well, let's bring in some of our colleagues. I mean, Tony Hoagland, Claudia Rankin. These are individuals who have been going across the country and they've been talking about this issue, and then some people feel like, okay, Tony shouldn't be writing these type of poems.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, we're saying we want to have this dialogue. Well, where does it begin if the poets are not doing it?
Yeah. You know, I'm doing it. I write about what moves me, and you know, in some ways I can't apologize for that. I don't think I need to apologize for that. And I feel like among many of my friends, you know, in Washington D.C. who are African American poets, you know, the work has been welcomed. I think you have to be respectful, you have to be careful. I mean, but that would be the case with any writer and any poem and any topic, I would think.
You know, when I look at your writing and your life, you seem to be part of a community, okay?
Yeah.
And when you look at the people that you have identified to write about, you talk about the good people. You write about Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela. What defines the good person?
It's somebody, I think, whose the trajectory or the unfolding of their life is other-centered. You know, lots of us are raised to, or you know, we receive information about, you know, you go to school, you get a job, you sort of stack things up. You know, you get a house, you have a family, you save for retirement. Right. That can be very self-oriented, or the self even just as defined as a family of 5 or 6 or 4 or 10. That's a small orientation. My sense is that goodness is bigger than that. Goodness is, we are all connected.
Well, you also have an international vision, along with Rosa Parks, Nelson Mandela. You talk about David Kato.
Yeah.
Talk about him. He was a gay activist in Uganda.
That's right.
And talk about his importance.
Very important person to me. He was a very publicly well-known gay activist in Uganda, as you said, lived in Kampala. You know, there was a movement of various fundamentalist American Christian preachers going to Uganda and really stoking the fires of what previously had not been there, a very vicious homophobia, to the point that a couple of newspapers in Uganda put pictures, home addresses of some of the most prominent gay activists in Uganda, including David Kato's. And he was subsequently brutally killed in the living room of his own home. So that's a person probably most Americans don't know. I think that's one of those things that, you know, we can tell the story from the bottom up. You know, this is a character people in America don't know. That's a story I want to tell.
Well, look at the story. I mean, if we begin with your upbringing, and then you see a case like this, it seems as if you would not be there to testify, and because of just the teachings that one would see from out of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, well, that would be a part of the Catholic Church that I left long ago because they left me long ago.
Do poets leave things behind?
Sure, some things. I mean, maybe not permanently and sort of unalterably, but I mean, I think we often have to take steps into the next thing and, at least with some amount of deliberation, leave practices that were tearing us down, leave some of those things behind. Maybe never forgetting them, you know, in an absolute way, because I think we've talked before about how important memory is,
right,
and remembering some of these things, but maybe leaving something behind in such a way that it doesn't have power over you.
Well, let me bring in a person that we both know, Lucille Clifton.
Yeah.
Okay, if I look at your work, I look at Lucille Clifton's work, I see some connections, definitely in terms of reference to the Bible, spirituality, and stuff. Even though you're writing about King and others, okay, when I look at Lucille, it's first person. For you, it isn't.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is something I'm moving into. You know, who knows what kinds of stages we go through, or, you know, seasons we go through. I always tell my creative writing students, putting I in the poem is probably the most important decision a poet makes. It's not a decision I make very often. It's not a decision I never make, but it's not one that I make very, very often, you're right. And she did a lot, and in some ways, you know, it gave her poems a kind of spaciousness and a room. I can read some of her poems in the first person and feel like I'm in there and I'm just listening to her, you know. If you read my poems about Willie Lewis, I don't want to be in that poem exactly. I really want that to honor him. Let me give him a voice and step out of the way a little bit.
Let's talk about this space, because if I looked at the work of Billy Collins, I know visually what I'm going to see on the page. When I look at your work, it seems like almost every poem is 2 lines.
Yeah.
Okay. Every now and then there's a terse and a quatrain slipping in there, but mostly it's 2 lines. Okay.
Yeah.
Is that what you feel comfortable with?
It is. Some years ago, what I think somebody suggested it to me to begin composing in 2-line, in couplets, because what I discovered is that I could see more options for line breaks. I could see more, maybe there's just more blank space on the page surrounding the words. So I could just see more choices. And then most of the times the poem just sort of stays in that form, which I'm very comfortable with. Other times it doesn't, you know, I'll end up making more, you know, stanzas out of different choices, sense or, you know, categorical kinds of decisions. But it began with a composing tactic that I could see more options.
Well, you know, when you say that, you know, because of what you were saying earlier about the research, things of that sort, one would expect maybe in your work a degree of density. Maybe I would look at your book and I would see some prose poems. I don't see that.
Yeah. It's not something I'm working on actually some now for what might be a sort of a new work, but the prose poem is not something I've done much of, yeah.
Are you reading a lot of prose poems in terms of just to open that door?
No, I read mostly poetry, and probably not prose poems, but I read a lot of fiction, which I think is part of my attraction to the stories of David Cato, of
Right.
Willie Lewis, some of these people, yeah.
Let's bring up something to take you back into the classroom where we see today a lot of spoken word. When you're teaching, literature and especially poetry, do you encourage your students to memorize poems?
Yes, I encourage them, at least initially, to memorize somebody else's, so that they get those words and the sounds and the pauses, literally into their mouths. I find I don't have to encourage them to do sort of spoken word work, because a lot of them are very attracted to that already, and it has a kind of an emotional, youthful punch. It's a kind of poetry that I certainly value, but it's not what I do myself. I think maybe I'm a decent reader of my own work,
Right.
but whenever somebody says, "Would you perform a poem?" I always think, I don't think I perform poems.
Right.
So that's not what I do. And there's probably a leaning with my students that they probably end up writing more what gets called page poems, because that's what they're being taught. But many of them do still work on the sort of spoken word and the performative aspects of them, and I encourage them, and they do some great work in both of those. They're not different genres,
Right.
both of those different styles, let's say.
3 books. Okay, we were talking about this in terms of, the first book does this, the second book does it. When do you know that, this third book is ready? And is this third book completely different from your first, where you can measure the growth now of yourself?
I think so. I don't know that it's completely different than the first book. A lot of the themes are similar, but I think the craft, the poems are better. I think the craft of the poems are better. I probably take more time. I'm more careful myself, I think, now. Although some risks also, but still taking care after the risk.
Right.
But I think this third book is called Ache. I think it's clearly my best work in my view.
Well, what I would be curious as an editor, many times what we see in your work is that you write a series of poems.
Yeah.
Okay. And I was wondering sometime with a series of poems where you say, okay, now that I'm putting this manuscript together, I'm going to take this section out. Do you encounter that problem?
Yes. Well, I don't think of it as a problem. It's a challenge. You sort of don't want to. If you like a certain couple of poems, or you like a series of poems, you want to leave it there. But once you really do see that it doesn't fit, or it doesn't fit here, or these might be terrific poems, but it doesn't fit in this manuscript. I feel like once I know that, I do know that, and I don't sort of fake myself out like that.
I still see you also, giving us these sections in the manuscript.
Yeah.
I mean, if I was a jazz musician, I wouldn't hire you. I'm just teasing. What I'm saying is I would be looking for more space. It seems like you're very organized in terms of how the poems are presented.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether when you look at how poems talk to each other, whether that's a thing where you have to force things in because this is a section and I'm going to the next section.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hope I'm not forcing things in. I've looked at every poem and asked myself a bunch of questions about where it is and does it work there. One thing I do battle in my mind around the manuscript kind of question is, and sections and all of that, is how do people read a book of poetry? I don't know for sure. I don't think most people go from poem 1 to poem last. I know I don't. Typically, I'm sort of all over the place. I'm flipping through, but I am I'm sort of interested in how a section does sort of unfold. I think there is an artfulness to the book, to the collection itself, and then to each section, or if there even are sections. And in this new collection, Ache, there are a lot of kind of very different poems from one another in it. Mm-hmm. What they have in common is that they all sort of involve some element of yearning or of the ache.
Well, that's we're getting to the end of our program. But if you're teaching yourself, going back to your teacher, you're teaching your work. What are the themes that jump out at the reader? I mean, what is if I go to the library and I say, okay, I'm going to take some Ross. I mean, what do I come away with? I mean, what are the themes?
Yeah. I think you're going to explore mortality. You're going to explore this, I hope, kind of a deep love of life, which then has to wrestle with the fact that it won't last forever. and then it even circles back, and the fact that it won't last forever feeds the deeper love. So let's really love today, because it won't always be here.
When you say that, I go back, maybe we will end on it, how you dealt with your father's death.
Yeah.
How did that seem like a poem to you in terms of what did you see happening here to yourself in terms of that?
I just wanted to hold on to stories about him. I wanted to keep his memory alive. We've talked about that. So I have written poems that tell stories that he told to us, stories that I rolled my eyes at when he would tell us it when I was a kid, you know. And then remembering last things, I think those were important things for me to remember.
On that note, Joseph Roth, this has been a nice time having you here in this program. Thank you.
Thank you.
And my name is E. Ethelbert Miller. You've been watching Hoco Polizzo's The Writing Life.